Hey friends, welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture is on Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, known as 1 Corinthians in our New Testament. In this Before You Read lecture, I want to provide an orientation to the city of Corinth briefly and to Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Then I want to provide an outline and sort of an overview of the letter itself. Then I want to spend a good amount of time thinking about the ways in which Paul responds to distinct issues in Corinth and what we can learn from that. And then I'll close, as always, with a few questions for you to consider as you read. In terms of our orientation, scholars think that 1 Corinthians was likely written around 54 CE to a community that Paul had founded perhaps 5 years earlier, sometime around the end of the 40s or early 50s CE. Paul is writing from Ephesus, and he expresses his desire to come and visit, but also his inability to do so. The city of Corinth itself had a reputation in the ancient world. It was well known. It was a larger city, as were many of the cities that Paul visited and founded communities. It was the capital city of Achaia, the province of Achaia. It had been rebuilt and refounded some 100 years earlier than Paul's visit. It was at an ideal location for sea commerce. And as the HarperCollins Study Bible points out, it had a large and prospering urban center with an ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse population. In large part, 1 Corinthians displays all of the components of an ancient letter. And as we'll see, 1 Corinthians is a highly responsive letter. It's responding to some distinct issues and some distinct questions that the Corinthians raise. The congregation itself, so far as we can tell from clues in the letter, was predominantly Gentile. It seems as though a good bit, or the majority of those first readers of the letter, were of a lower social or economic status, although there were certainly members who had more means or had more prestige. We can see at the end of chapter 16 a number of leaders who are mentioned, and the names there give us clues about the makeup of the community. And it seems likely, although this is a little bit of speculation, that there were originally a number of different house churches, smaller house churches that met in different locations, but that occasionally, how often, we don't know, weekly, monthly, quarterly, who knows, but that occasionally they all came together for a common meal. And it was when they shared in this common meal together that many of the issues and problems rose to the surface. Briefly, we can outline 1 Corinthians pretty simply. We see in chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, the opening, the greeting and the opening. Here again, we see a prayer, and as I've said in a previous lecture, prayers are a key way for Paul to communicate his theological message and many of the motifs and things of importance in the letter. Then in 1:18 through 2:16, Paul discusses what I would call the logic of the word of the cross, or a discussion of how this message of a crucified Messiah sort of engages and really relativizes the world's notions of power, prestige, and so forth. Then in 3:1 through 4:21, Paul deals directly with the reputation of quarrels and divisions in the community and how those are playing out in the community life together. In 5:1 through 14:40, the largest bulk of material is really Paul's systematic response to a number of issues that the Corinthians are facing. These are things that Paul has either heard about orally through Chloe's people, or he's read about through a letter that the Corinthians sent to him that we no longer have access to. In chapter 15, Paul goes to great lengths to discuss the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of the body. And then in 16, 1 through 18, Paul lays out his travel plans and his plans for moving forward, and then his final greetings in verses 19 through 24. So that's a broad outline and overview to 1 Corinthians. When you survey the sorts of problems that Paul deals with in Corinthians, things like division and one-upsmanship, things like taking other believers to court, things like marriage and betrothals, things like how to eat and what to eat and how to celebrate the Lord's Supper, what one gets is that not all of these problems are especially spiritual in nature or deeply theological in nature. A number of them are actually very this worldly and sort of like problems that raise whenever you get human societies together. And so the really interesting thing about 1 Corinthians is the way that Paul responds. Paul takes each and every one of these issues and in clear ways and sometimes not clear ways, frames them in directly theological ways. He centers them theologically. And so that the course of action that he recommends, the exhortations or the admonishments are all sort of framed in a larger theological response. And so this, I think, as contemporary readers, allows us to form what one New Testament scholar has called imaginative analogies, so that we can begin to think through our own issues, our own day-to-day, this worldly issues in a similar theological way. There's kind of a circular or a back and forth motion where Paul has certain theological convictions and he filters through the issues and the problems through those theological convictions, but then vice versa. These issues and problems cause Paul to reflect more closely or more carefully theologically. And so there's this circle of theological reasoning that we see, I think, at work in 1 Corinthians, and that's what's really exciting about the letter. So as you read this letter, one of the things that I would encourage you to look for is these 4 anchors of Paul's thought, 4 anchors in Paul's theological reasoning. And the first I've already mentioned, and that is the crisis of the cross. How does the message of a crucified Messiah and that this is God's way of saving humanity, God's way of demonstrating wisdom, how does this relativize and sort of contradict the world's notions of power and wisdom and prestige? The second anchor in Paul's theological reasoning is unity and upbuilding. Throughout his exhortations and his advice, he will use the unity of the community and the upbuilding of others as sort of as values to be upheld almost at any cost. So pay attention to the way unity and upbuilding go. The third thing that Paul pays attention to is the body, the human body, as well as the Corinthian body, the group of believers. And so Paul directs attention to what individuals are doing with their body, but also what the gathered community is doing as a body. So pay attention to the body language, not just in 1 Corinthians where he talks about the resurrection of the body, but throughout the letter, not just chapter 15, but throughout the letter. Finally, the fourth anchor in Paul's theological reasoning is what I would call between the ages. And this is Paul's conviction that Jesus is going to come back in his lifetime. And therefore, certain parts of our human experience, things like marriage, even the desire to get free from slavery, are relativized in this anticipation that Paul and the Corinthians are living in between the resurrection of Jesus on the one hand and his final victorious return on the other. And at that return, God will set all things right. That's Paul's sort of fundamental conviction. And so that's an anchor in Paul's thinking, I think, that can help us navigate and work our way through 1 Corinthians. So once again, the 4 anchors of Paul's theological reasoning are the cross, unity and upbuilding, mind the body, and between the ages. Finally, just a few suggestions or questions, really, about 1 Corinthians that you can engage as you work your way through this important letter. The first is, again, just to pay attention to the ways that Paul's central theological conviction, those 4 anchors, are informing his pastoral response. How do you see those at work? The second is a sort of a broader question. And it is, what are the issues or the questions in 1 Corinthians that are really relevant to us, and which ones aren't? One that I love to hold up is the question of meat sacrificed to idol. This is a live question for the Corinthians, not so much for us. So by attending to those things that can be directly relevant to us and those that cannot be, we can begin to think through the analogies and the metaphors and the other ways of thinking and applying Paul's letters to our own life. The third thing that I would point out as a question is, what do we make of all of these church problems? Do you think that's a good thing? Is there a comfort in knowing that the church has always been a kind of messy and complex reality? Or does this view of a church as kind of fractured and fighting, does that challenge you, or does that make you feel uncomfortable about the assumed pristine nature of the early church? Well, thanks for your attention and your time for watching this video lecture. I hope that it is helpful, and I hope that it will enhance your engagement with 1 Corinthians. Now, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your observations. Happy reading.